I thought this picture would be a good way to give a title to the lesson we're going to have today, because it's all about a man whose name is not here, but deals with something that is very significant, I would say, in terms of what it means to have the Bible the way we have it today. Now, I will not get into that probably until next week. But what is the background of this? David has been fleeing his father-in-law, Saul, who has been trying to kill him. Through the help of his wife, Michal, and her brother, Jonathan, David was able to get away, and one of the places he went to very quickly was to the priests at Nob. Nob is a city just a couple of miles from Jerusalem. It's a city that was inhabited by some of the exiled priests from the city of Shiloh. Shiloh, as you recall, was defeated by the Philistines and destroyed, and many people escaped, like Samuel escaped, and so did a lot of the priests, and they moved to Shiloh. Somehow or another, David's family, Jesse, his father, got involved with Samuel and with the priests of Nob. When David found himself in this difficult situation of his father-in-law Saul trying to kill him, what he did is eventually went to Nob and told the priests at Nob, and told Ahimelech, who was the chief priest at that time, told Ahimelech that he was on a secret mission for Saul, but didn't tell him exactly what it was. But he didn't have any weapons. So what happens is that Ahimelech gives him this sword. Well, what sword was that? That was the sword that was taken from Goliath when David had killed Goliath. And so David receives that sword. Now, the important part of this picture is not Ahimelech, the sword, or David. It's right back here. You see the man back there? That's Doeg. Doeg is one of Saul's henchmen. Actually, he's Saul's sheep herder. He's an Edomite. The reason that he becomes so significant is that, the reason he becomes so significant is the fact that he saw Ahimelech give that sword to David. And the situation is going to arise where Saul asks the question of some of his henchmen, "Where is David? How come I know nothing about David?" And this man, Doeg, said, "I know where David is, I think, because he got this sword from Ahimelech." So what Saul did is call together all of the priests of Nob to question them what they knew about David. He finally got it out of them that they had given the sword to David. What he then, so it's, well, for goodness sake, there's some slides that are missing here. I'll tell you what happened. What Saul then did, got all those priests together and said, "Who's going to execute these priests?" Nobody would do it except Doeg. He was not an Israelite. And Doeg took it upon himself to kill off those priests. It says 85 of them. He killed them all off, except one of them got away. Actually, the son of Ahimelech, a guy by the name of Abiathar, got away. He escaped, and what he did was he went from there to the cave of Adullam. At the cave of Adullam was where David had gone. Actually, what had happened is that David, after he had gotten that sword, went to the Philistines. And the Philistines thought that David was a danger because David behaved as if he were insane. He drooled and everything else. They got rid of him. And that's when David went to this cave of Adullam. This cave of Adullam was a sort of a refuge that he went to for his family and for his friends. In the meantime, what had happened is that Doeg, the Edomite, told Saul that it was these chiefs that were responsible for it. And he took it upon himself to kill off, it says 85 of them. But one of them got away, and that was the man named Abiathar. He's in italics. He was the son of Ahimelech. He escaped, and he went where? Well, you go to the enemy of your enemy. He went to Adullam. He went to David. This last bit is the most significant. David says to Abiathar, "Stay with me, fear not, for he that seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping." And he was for the rest of his life. As a matter of fact, he outlived David. And he was right next to David with everything that David did from there on. Now, if you read the Bible rather carefully, you find out that David had a rather interesting life. And this man Abiathar was involved in just about every bit of it. Now, one of the fascinating things about Abiathar was that he was a priest. I'm going to now look at what are called the outlaw years of David, where that priest is involved. Here is a map. It's a very good map in this regard, and that is that up here we have Nob. This is where where those priests were. After Nob, David goes down to the Philistines and then goes to Adullam. Adullam is cave. Now you notice this trick here. Last week I talked about that. David immediately took his family out of Judah and brought them to Moab. I mentioned last week the reason for doing that is that David's great-grandmother was a Moabite. Does anybody remember her name? Ruth. Ruth was David's great-grandmother. David goes back to Adullam. And while he's at Adullam, this is when Abiathar joins him. Now, when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, he came with an ephod in his hand. Now, what does it mean, an ephod? That was part of the priestly garments that were used by the chief priest at that particular time. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired of the Lord, well, we'll see that slide a bit later on also. In other words, David makes use of this ephod. Here is the ephod. This is that apron. This is a breastplate of jewels worn above the apron. But the ephod is what the chief priest wore when he was going to inquire of God. And what I've got here are a couple of slides where we see some more things about the priestly garments. And the fact that David did call on Abiathar to act as his chief priest. It is interesting to go through the whole of what we have in terms of what David did in those outlaw years. It's fascinating reading, great reading. I'm going to mention two things, and that is Saul pursued David in that area that I mentioned around the cave of Adullam, and he sought David to kill him. There are two occasions when David actually had the opportunity of killing Saul. One time they came and found Saul sleeping in a cave, and we find that David actually cut off a part of his garment so that he was able to say, "Look, I could have slain you, but I didn't." Another time he actually finds him in the field, and David took away his spear and his jug of wine, or jug of water. And David approaches call after this and says, "Look, I could have killed you and I didn't kill you." Saul starts to get a little bit some qualms about killing David. It doesn't make an awful lot of difference because after about 2.5 years of being an outlaw, David said, "This is enough of it. I'm going to leave." And what he decides to do is to leave that area and go to the Philistines. I'm only going to show you this thing called the Philistine years. Naturally, there's a lot more to it than the Philistine years. Some of the greatest reading that you'll find in the Old Testament is in these Philistine years. David goes to Achish, who was the king of the Philistines. From Achish, he demands or asks for a place of his own. Now, this is the best I could find, because the place that he gets is a place called Ziklag. Can you find Ziklag on here? My folks, it's somewhere between Beersheba. Here's Ziklag. See Ziklag? It was at that time a Philistine city, and Achish, the Philistine king, gives it to David and says, you can operate out of there. Later we find out Ziklag being referred to as a state of Judah because it belonged to Judah ever since, and that's why it shows up on this map. This is an interesting map in one regard. Sometimes when you find Ziklag, you all see a question mark because nobody knows exactly where it was, except that it was very near the Philistine territory and very near the territory of the Jews. When David and his men came to David finds favor from Achish, because what David did when he was in Ziklag is he'd go and raid the Philistine cities and kill everybody in the Philistine cities, but not tell anybody. But he would tell Achish, he would tell the people in Judah, after the Philistines. Then he would turn around and he'd say it the other way, I'm attacking the Philistines. He was able to fool Achish to making Achish believe that he was completely, totally responsible to Achish, that David would do whatever Achish wanted. This all changed when there was a war imminent between Saul and the Philistines, a war that takes place further up to the north, near a place called Aphek. And what happens is that David goes along with the Philistines up north to help the Philistines fight Saul. But some of the Philistine chiefs said, isn't this the same character that was with Saul at one time, and he was regarded as a very noble warrior? How do we know he's not going to turn on us now? And they convinced Achish that David better not go along. So after marching all that way up, all the way from Ziklag, all the way up north to where this battle is going to take place, David has to go back and he returns to Ziklag. But when he gets to Ziklag, what he finds out is rather disturbing, and that is that the Amalekites had come into that city and had sacked it and kidnapped his wives and his children and taken all the sheep and all the herds and everything else. They devastated the place. Here's a map. Here's Ziklag way down here. This is where this battle is going to be taking place. So you see David had gone a long way, and it's not surprising he was gone from his hometown for a reasonable length of time. Then David said to Abiathar, back to the priest, said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? And he answered them, pursue, you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. Again, we see Abiathar acting as the chief priest and proclaiming certain things that David had to hear. And David spoke them from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men and mounted camels and fled. In other words, he went after the Amalekites, and David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, sons or anything that had been taken. David brought them all back. David also captured all the flocks and the herds and the people and drove those cattle before him and said, this is David's spoil. In other words, it worked out very well for David. He got everything that the Amalekites had taken, and now it was considered to be his. But here comes a turning point in a rather interesting fashion. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. I put this in smaller type. It lists all the different cities that got part of that spoil from the Amalekites. Can you see what David's doing? He's starting to get the people in Judah on his side. He's trying to find some way of making friends with the folks in Judah. And he's rather successful in that regard. And he inquires again of Abiathar, what shall I do now? And shall I go up into the cities of Judah? And the Lord said, go up, to which shall I go up? And he says, to Hebron. So all of a sudden, we find David making friends with a lot of the people in Judah, and also leaving a territory that was very close to the Philistines and going to Hebron. And when he was in Hebron, what does he do? When he was in Hebron, he gets to the situation where the people in that area regard him so highly, they want to make him a king. Now, the situation between the 12 tribes in Judah is something that we're going to have to discuss sometime in the future. Judah is a little bit different from the other 10 tribes. And what we find is that David became the king of Judah. Since they're in time to, there they anointed David the king of the house of Judah, and just of Judah. This would have been about 1010 or 1010 BC. The northern tribes were still up there, the 10 northern tribes. Saul died in that battle. That's the battle in which Saul killed himself. Saul died in that battle. His son Ishbosheth was made the new king of the 10 tribes. Ishbosheth had a general by the name of Abner, who actually did most of the negotiating for Ishbosheth. And Abner and Ishbosheth didn't get along too well for a very interesting reason. Can you think of what that reason might be? A woman. Apparently, Abner had taken a liking to one of the members of Saul's entourage of concubines, a woman by the name of Rizpah. Ishbosheth thought that, hey, this guy is encroaching on my territory. Abner then decides that he doesn't have to be treated that way, and he decides to get together with David. And between Abner and David, what we find is that an agreement has been made in which the 10 tribes to the north will join the tribe of Judah to the south. And for the first time, we have the 12 tribes of Israel. Doesn't last long, only through two kings, but we have all 12 tribes. Here he's being anointed king of Judah, and he was 30 years old when he began to reign. Next one. After he'd been in Judah for 7 years and 6 months, then he went to Jerusalem. Now, we talked about this many times in this class before. Hebron is in the south. The people in the north didn't look that kindly to the people in the south. And what David decided to do is something that was done later on in this country when the United States decided to set its capital in Washington rather than in Philadelphia or in Richmond, somewhere in between. It turned out there was a city of Jerusalem, sometimes it's referred to as Jebus, which was right in between. It was in the territory of Benjamin. And what happens is that David takes it upon himself to move his kingdom from Hebron to Jerusalem. The story that's involved in that being accomplished, again, is a nice story, but it's a part of the story of David, not a part of the story of Abiathar. And I want to stick with Abiathar as much as we can. So David reigned over Israel, and David administered justice and peace to all the people. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recovered. This Joab shows up quite a bit. He actually was a nephew of David. Zeruiah was David's sister. And Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests, and Sierra was the secretary. Now, I might italicize that. That question mark is mine. There apparently was a transcription problem, because Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech. Ahimelech is not the son of Abiathar. The important part of this verse, unfortunately, it doesn't get changed from one edition of the Bible to another, is that all of a sudden we find something that Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Abiathar had been the priest for David throughout all those outlaw years, through the time with the Philistines and the 7 years when they were in Hebron. And all of a sudden, when they get to Jerusalem, Abiathar becomes a co-priest. This man Zadok becomes a priest along with him. What happened? The answer is that we really don't know completely what had happened, but one good guess is that Zadok may very well have been a priest of the Almighty God in Jerusalem for many, many generations. If you go all the way back to the time of Abraham, you find that when Abraham came close to the city of Jerusalem, Melchizedek, see the similarity in the name? Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God, greeted Abraham, indicating that the people in Jerusalem probably had been worshiping the same God as the Israelites, but differently. When David moved in, Abiathar was appointed priest along with Zadok, and so we have two co-priests. As a matter of fact, they acted as two co-priests for the next 30 years. How well did that go? The answer is that we really don't know how well it went, because they had very different points of view. Zadok was a part of a well-established society, the society of Jerusalem, the society in which people had been living for centuries, all the way back to the time of Abraham. On the other hand, what about Abiathar? Abiathar had been, along with David, an outlaw for some years, had been with David at the time of the Philistines, had been the chief priest when they were in Hebron. Now all of a sudden, he finds himself in this environment of Jerusalem with this co-priest, Zadok, who probably had a very different point of view. The only thing I could find that indicated that they ever worked together was at a time when Zadok and Abiathar worked together when the rebellion of Absalom took place. David was about to leave the city, and Abiathar and Zadok took the Ark of the Covenant, which at that time was in Jerusalem, and took it to the river so that they could cross the river with David when he went into hiding. And David said, "No, don't do that. Bring the ark back, because I don't want to have the kingdom established somewhere other than Jerusalem. Bring it back to Jerusalem, and I will return to Jerusalem." And we find that that Abiathar and Zadok do bring the ark back, and I think I actually have a picture of that. Here is the ark being transported back to Jerusalem. That, as I said, is the only time that we have any real indication that the two of them may have worked together. This becomes very interesting because, as I indicated, the two had very, very different backgrounds. Probably the most significant thing about Abiathar's background is that it stretches all the way back to what? All the way back to Shiloh. It stretches all the way back to the time when the Israelites were transported from Egypt by whom? By Moses. By Moses, who was the great lawgiver. That is not a part of the heritage of Zadok or the people that were in Jerusalem, but it is a very important part of the priests of Shiloh and certainly of Abiathar, that he has that background of Moses and the law of Moses being so significant. But they eventually did separate. Why? Well, what happens that David got old, and when he's about 70 years old, it became apparent that he wasn't going to last a lot longer. When he dies, what is the question? Who is going to become the king? And this is where a division took place that was rather significant. Abiathar had grown up with David and David's family. Abiathar had been present when David got married and when he had his first three sons. Abiathar was there when Amnon was born. And Amnon was killed by whom? by Absalom, the second son that was born. And Absalom was killed. And there was one son that was left, Adonijah. But he was already a grown man, and Abiathar had known him since he was a baby. And by all means, by all rights, Abiathar, in his mind, figured if the king dies, his eldest son should become the new king. And he sided with the idea that Adonijah should be the new king. And siding with Adonijah was Joab, a cousin of David. And they felt they were part of the old regime, the old kingdom. And Adonijah was a part of that. But the Bible tells us there's a little bit more to it than that. Because apparently in this situation in which we find David getting himself involved with Bathsheba, they had a son who was born, but a second son was born to Bathsheba. And David had made a promise, apparently, to Bathsheba that that second son would become the new king. That second son, of course, was Solomon. Here we run into a very strange situation. We got two camps right in this vicinity of Jerusalem. In one of these camps, we have Adonijah with Joab and Abiathar as the strongest proponents of Abiathar becoming a king. But in the city, we have another group that says, well, wait a minute. And Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei and Rhea, and David's mighty men were not with Adonijah. They did not side with Adonijah at all. Why not? Because they were all Jebusites. They were all people that lived in Jerusalem long before David had come to Jerusalem. Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fatlings by the serpent stone, which is beside the Enregel, that's a part of Jerusalem. And he invited all his brothers and the king's sons and all the royal officials of Judah. But he did not invite Nathan. Who was Nathan? Nathan was a resident of Jerusalem. Nor Benaiah, nor any of the men, or Solomon. In other words, what had happened is that there suddenly was a division between Adonijah in his camp, with Adonijah making a big feast, and the camp in Jerusalem. What happens next? Then Nathan said to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Hilkiah, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? Now therefore come, give me your counsel, that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go in at once to King David and say to him, did you not, my lord the king, swear to your maidservant, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon the throne? Why then is Adonijah could declare himself as king? And while they were still speaking with the king, also came in with, I also came in with, that's the prophet. Now therefore, let me give you counsel that you may save your own life and the life of Solomon. Go in at once to King David and say to him, did you not, my lord, swear to your maidservant, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me and sit upon my throne? Why then is Adonijah king? And while you are still speaking with the king, I will also come in after you. That's Nathan. Bathsheba went before the king to his chamber and was very old. And Abishai, that was the girl that had been brought to David when he was very old, the Shumite, was ministering to them. And while they were still speaking with the king, Nathan the prophet came. Here is Nathan the prophet. And when he came in there before the king, he bowed before the king and with his face to the ground. And Nathan said, my lord the king, have you said, Adonijah shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne? For he has gone down on this day and has sacrificed oxen, fatlings, and sheep, in abundance and invited all the king's sons, Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar the priest, and behold, they are eating and drinking and saying, long live King Adonijah. Well, that's all that had to be said. Here is a picture with all of them confronting David. This is Abishai, that's the young girl. One of these is Bathsheba, one of these is Nathan, and I don't know who the others are. But they're approaching David in what is almost his deathbed. And David said, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, that they may come before the king. And the king said to them, take with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon my own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet there anoint him king over Israel, and then blow the trumpet, saying, long live King Solomon. In other words, go and counteract this action that you're seeing on the behalf of Benaiah, of Adonijah. Here's a picture of the only picture I can find of Solomon sitting on a mule. But there he is made the king. And he was the king. Now, have any of you paid any attention to television in the last couple of months? Have you noticed that when one government comes into power, what they do with the other government? They downgrade it. All right. Back in those days, they did the same thing, but in a somewhat different faction. What do you think they generally did? They killed off the opposition. They killed them off as fast as they could. And what happens is that David gets together with Solomon and says, if you are going to stay king, you're going to have to do something about this situation, that there were people that opposed your becoming king. Who opposed your becoming king? Well, Joab, for one, the head of the army, and Abiathar, the chief priest. They both opposed Solomon becoming king. They wanted Adonijah to become a king. So he gives advice to Solomon as to what to do. Moreover, you know that, okay, Abner, son of Ner, all right. First he talks about Joab. Let's get rid of Joab. This Joab is nothing but a murderer. Joab was responsible for murdering, it talks this here, Abner, who was the head of the 10 tribes, the general of the 10 tribes, and Amasa, who also was a relative of David. Actually, he was a cousin of David. And Joab killed both of them because Joab wanted control. Okay. Therefore, according to your wisdom, do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. Here's Joab killing Abner. Here's a picture of, this is this Amasa. There's another whole rebellion that we did not talk about. Amasa took the place of Joab after Joab had been involved in the murder or the killing of Absalom. And Joab was taken from the command of the army, and this man Amasa was put in charge. Joab did not take kindly to Amasa being in charge of the army, so how did he solve it? He killed Amasa. And David says, no, don't let him go down in peace. What we have here is a picture of Joab running for his life. And I found a couple of examples of Joab doing what? Hanging onto the horns of the altar, trying to hope for relief in that fashion, hanging to the horns of the altar. But Joab was killed, was slain right at the horns of the altar. Who does that leave? Abiathar. Now what are you going to do with Abiathar? Was Abiathar a significant part of David's life? And to Abiathar, the priest, the king said, go to Anathoth, to your estate, for you deserve death, but I will not at this time put you to death, because you bore the ark of the Lord of God before David, my father, and because you shared in all the affliction of my father. In other words, Abiathar suddenly is spared. Why is he spared? Because of all the background that he had with David. And so what he says, we're not going to kill you. We're just going to send you off to Anathoth. Well, where's Anathoth? Here's Jabus. Does anybody know Jabus? That's Jerusalem. That's somebody who's getting fancy with a map and doesn't want to write Jerusalem. Jerusalem's right here. This is only a couple of miles away. Now you'll notice right is in the same vicinity, right near Jerusalem. Here's Anathoth. Now Anathoth is a rather interesting city, to say the very least, and I'll tell you why. When the tribes were assigned territory in Israel, all of the tribes got territory except the tribe of Levi. Levi was not given any territory. What Levi was given was the fact that they will serve in a different fashion. But there are cities in Israel that are going to be regarded as Levitical cities. Cities are Levirate cities. These are places where anybody from the tribe of Israel can come and buy property and can live. Anathoth was one of these cities. What do you think you might find in Anathoth? A lot of people that were from the tribe of Levi. And what were the people from the tribe of Levi? They were people that were associated with the priesthood. So what is happening is that Abiathar is sent to Anathoth, into a place where there are a lot of priests, which will probably include whatever priests were left of Shiloh and any other priests that were sympathetic to Abiathar, and he is to live. And if I've got this correct, this is what should go. We don't hear anything more. Nothing more about Abiathar. He disappears from the scene completely. And yet, it could be said that he probably was one of the more influential people that we have in the Old Testament in terms of our getting the Bible. The next lesson that I start is going to start with things that took place 300 years later. 300 years later, we're going to pick up this story again. And we're going to find out that probably Abiathar, in his coming to Anathoth, played a rather significant role in one regard, and that is it kept the people that were followers of Moses, the people that had the background of Shiloh, the people that were interested in the law and were interested in Moses as being their leader, kept that idea alive for 300 years. Let me remind you of something. The Jews have not had their own kingdom since approximately 605 BC. Up until 1948. Did the Jews disappear? No, they lived through all of history, the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, medieval times, even into modern times. It wasn't the 1940s. Why? Because the Jews had a rather interesting ability, and that is to keep their traditions and their religion alive. And apparently what we have to conclude is that very likely Abiathar may have done the same thing with those priests that were in Anathoth and kept their beliefs alive. Do those beliefs show up? I'll give you a little bit of a hint in terms of what we'll talk about next week. They show up in a book that appeared in the temple one day, a book that right now I think we can regard rather safely as being the oldest book that we have in the Bible in terms of when it was written. It probably was written around 650 BC. It is the book of Deuteronomy. And the influence that Deuteronomy had on the rest of the history of the Israelites and, you might say, of Christianity, you cannot overestimate it. So next week we'll talk about how that book of Deuteronomy came about and who was involved.